Alright, welcome back. Sebastian here. So time for my power rankings for the 2025 Las Vegas Grand Prix. Starting right away with driver number 20, and that is none other than Gabriel Bortoleto. Poor qualifying performance from him. He qualified 18th. I'm not going to really go into the qualifying gaps between teammates a whole lot today. Just because of the wet qualifying session means a lot of the gaps are quite a lot bigger than they would be in the dry, and slightly less relevant. But nonetheless, qualified 18th. His teammate, meanwhile, qualified in P11, got himself up into Q2, so underperformed in qualifying. And then in the Grand Prix itself, pretty clumsy mistake at the first corner, took out Stroll, took out Gasly as well. Gasly, of course, was able to continue, but still basically ruined his race. And so for Bortoleto, he picked up a 5-place grid penalty for the next race in Qatar. To be honest, I'm a little bit surprised it's not a 10, but I think the penalties correspond with a certain time penalty in that kind of conversion. So it's kind of one of those things. Number 19 is none other than Alex Albon. So for Albon, poor qualifying session, qualified 16th, got knocked out in Q1. And even more than that, was probably the only driver who made a really big mistake in qualifying. Big snap of oversteer, kind of hit the wall, kind of going down the pit straight. Of course, there's the kink in the straight, but yeah, it's the same kind of full throttle area. And then in the Grand Prix, a bit of a clumsy maneuver with Hamilton, clipped his front wing on the back of Hamilton's car. Very similar to what Hamilton did to Bortoleto the week before in Brazil. Actually, it wasn't a week ago, it was 2 weeks ago. My apologies. But still, two pretty clumsy errors, and his teammate had a pretty strong weekend. So, all in all, pretty poor Grand Prix all around for Albon. Alright, number 18 is none other than Yuki Tsunoda. So for Tsunoda, another poor qualifying session, qualified 19th, only out-qualified Hamilton. And then in the Grand Prix, finishes the race in 12th. Of course, that was 14th in the road before the two McLarens got disqualified. Even with that, even with a couple of drivers in the midfield getting taken out of the first corner, Tsunoda was not able to get into the points. And even then, even though he started from the pit lane, which again, on a weekend like this where overtaking was not super easy, still finishes 97 seconds behind his teammate, who won the Grand Prix, of course. So I think it's really hard to put Tsunoda anywhere but somewhere pretty close to the bottom. Okay, moving on to number 17 and 17th, I'm going to go with Franco Colapinto. So for Colapinto, qualified 15th. Really the only positive I can say about his weekend is that he got himself out of Q1. But still out-qualified by his teammate Gasly, who had a pretty strong result this weekend. I felt had strong performance this weekend, not necessarily a strong result. And then in the Grand Prix, just had really poor pace overall. Finished 15th on the road, which I believe was the last classified finisher. So finishes behind Lawson, who had to pit with the front wing damage, and again finished behind his teammate, who got spun around on the opening lap. So despite the fact that he was not particularly badly affected by that kind of first corner chaos, Colapinto still kind of found a way to kind of fall down through the order as the race went along and ends up finishing 15th. So a bit of a disappointing weekend, I would say. Overall, just pretty slow all around for Colapinto. Okay, number 16 is Liam Lawson. So for Lawson, pretty disappointing weekend overall, just especially given that he had potential to score really big points, and given what would eventually happen later in the Grand Prix with the two McLarens getting disqualified, there's potential for big points here, and Lawson unfortunately kind of threw it all away of his own accord. So for Lawson, qualifying though was really strong. It was a 6th place, did out-qualify his teammate Hadjar. And so that really prevents Lawson from being right at the very, very bottom. The qualifying performance, unusually in Lawson's case, was actually the strong point of the weekend. But in the Grand Prix, clattered with Piastri on the opening corner. Like, it wasn't a super egregious collision or contact. It wasn't like Bortoleto. He didn't pick up a good penalty or anything for it. But it did definitely, it caused front wing damage to his car. Caused him to basically lose the front wing, and then he had to come in and pit, and his race was basically heavily compromised from there, and yeah, came home for a 14th place finish. Okay, number 15, and I think in a normal, not necessarily normal, but I think in circumstances where I felt like you maybe have a couple less drivers who really, I felt, underperformed, big mistakes and stuff, I think ordinarily Lewis Hamilton would end up a little bit lower. But for Hamilton, qualifying was a disaster, qualified dead last. Definitely one of the worst qualifying performances of Hamilton's entire career. I know the Ferrari is generally not great in the wet, and I mean Leclerc had his struggles too in qualifying, but still for Hamilton it was quite the shocker. And then in the Grand Prix, just did not have the pace that his teammate did. His teammate was able to pick off a number of cars, had some very nice overtakes. Hamilton, however, spent most of the Grand Prix stuck behind the Haas of Ocon. And even then, when he did get into relatively clean air, he was still slower than Nico Hülkenberg. So, pretty disappointing Grand Prix. Does salvage 4 points from it, which is better than some drivers that we've seen recently who've started from basically at the back and have basically attempted to make their way forward in front-running cars. But still, definitely overall, very, very disappointing weekend for Hamilton. Okay, number 14. 14th is Oliver Bearman. So I felt like it's a bit harsh to have Bearman beside Hamilton, but really I felt like the bottom 6 drivers, there was a big gap between those 6 drivers and then everyone else. And so for 14th, Bearman, I didn't think he had a terrible weekend, but it was still not particularly strong, especially compared to what we've seen recently. Qualified 14th, out qualified by his teammate, but still very close gap between the two of them. And then in the Grand Prix, did benefit actually from the shuffle at the first lap with the crash. So he was actually in a pretty good points paying position, but just kind of went backwards in the Grand Prix. Ends up finishing 10th on the road. Actually, that's not even correct. It's 12th on the road, but of course promoted to 10th with the penalty. And so, again, kind of a bit lucky that the two McLarens got disqualified to even score points, but looked slower than his teammate, both qualifying in the race. And so 14th, I think, is an appropriate spot for Bearman. Now, number 13 is Lance Stroll. So for Stroll, not a whole lot to say for his weekend. Qualifying, to be honest, looked very, very strong. Without that mistake that his strategy team, and I think Stroll kind of admitted that he was also kind of a bit guilty in that. Going onto the intermediate tire at the end of Q2, when I think really he should have just stayed on the wet. That really cost him a spot, in the top 10. And then, of course, was kind of an innocent victim in Bortoletto's crash. But yeah, so not his fault at all. So again, strong underlying qualifying pace. Race was kind of a write-off. But again, that blunder in qualifying with going onto the intermediate tire in Q2 means that I kind of have to put him a little bit lower than where I think he otherwise would be. But still, it was definitely not a bad weekend by Stroll's pretty low standards. Okay, moving on to number 12. Number 12, I'm going to go with Oscar Piastri. So for Piastri, qualified 5th. His teammate qualified on pole. The McLaren, I think, was the fastest car by a pretty decent margin in the intermediate conditions. I think in the full wets, it was a lot more touch and go with the Red Bull and the Mercedes, but I think in the intermediate conditions, as we've seen all season long, the McLarens just tend to be a lot stronger. And so the fact that Piastri qualified 5th was, I think, a bit of a disappointment. He made a mistake, I think, on one of his laps, and then another lap, I think he got caught out by another driver. But nonetheless, in the Grand Prix, it was a bit of a scruffy performance. I think he lost positions on the opening lap, I believe, to one of the Racing Bulls. Then had a bit of a poor accident that allowed Leclerc to overtake him in a race where there weren't a ton of overtakes. Then spent a lot of the second half of the race behind Antonelli's Mercedes, not able to overtake despite much fresher tires. At the end of the day, it kind of all became a moot point. He finished 4th on the road, but got disqualified in the end, and it actually ends up helping his championship chances as he goes from being 30 points behind Norris to now only being 24. But the flip side of that is that he's now level on points with Verstappen, which means that the odds of him losing P2 in the championship are a lot higher than they were before the disqualification. So again, we'll have to see how things go the last couple of races. Qatar is a circuit where he's done relatively well historically compared to Norris, especially compared to some of these recent races in North America or in the Americas in general, where Piastri's really struggled. So it'll be a really good litmus test, I think, for Piastri to see if it's a really, region track specific issue or if it's, a true real downturn in pace compared to what we saw in the first 2/3 of the season, I would say, from Piastri. Okay, moving on to number 11, and number 11 I'm going to go with Fernando Alonso. So for Alonso, qualified 7th, which I think was a pretty decent result. That being said, the qualifying pace I think was pretty even with Stroll. I think Alonso just made the better decision to not go on the intermediate tires in Q2. Otherwise, it could have been Alonso's first qualifying defeat of the season. But stayed on the wets, qualified P7, which I think was a pretty decent result on the intermediate tire. But then in the race, just kind of went backwards, finished 13th at the checkered flag, moved up to 11th with the penalties, or with the disqualifications, I should say. And so I think the overall pace for Alonso was not amazing. I think the Aston Martin was always going to go backwards in the race, so that's not really Alonso's fault. But that being said, I think overall 11th place is a decent spot for him. Okay, now going into the top 10, number 10, I'm going to go with Esteban Ocon, one of his stronger weekends of the season. And I think it's not a coincidence that Ocon had a relatively decent qualifying session in a wet qualifying session where some of his struggles in the wet dry sessions with rear instability obviously are a lot more masked because the conditions are a lot more chaotic, and Ocon historically has been a pretty good driver in wet conditions. So that helped set up his weekend, and race pace I think in general for Ocon was very good. Was a little bit better than his teammate Behrman as well. So I think overall for Ocon, decent weekend, gets a couple points, and again, so good reward for him. And he'll be happy with that after I think he's had a pretty rough second half of the season. I think the trick in the last couple of races of the season is can he get his qualifying form turned around in dry conditions. Okay, moving on to number 9, and number 9 I'm going to go with Pierre Gasly. So again, a bit like Stroll, a weekend there's not a whole lot to talk about outside of qualifying. So qualifying I thought very, very strong, qualified 10th in the Grand Prix. Probably would have, I would say, preferred if qualifying had stayed with the full, wet enough that it was that the full wet tires were better. But nonetheless, I think qualified 10th. And then, of course, kind of an innocent victim of Bortoletto's mistake. Finished the Grand Prix in 13th, which was 15th at the checkered flag, of course. But still beat his teammate, despite probably picking up a bit of damage and the fact that he was spun around and was near the bottom at the end of the first lap. So I think overall race was pretty decent for Gasly. Just did not have the luck or the results to show for it. Okay, number 8, I'm going to go with Kimi Antonelli. So for Antonelli, of course, Grand Prix was very, very strong. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But qualifying, another qualifying that was a little bit, I'm not going to say a little bit, quite disappointing, given he's driving a Mercedes. Qualified 17th. His teammate, of course, started in the top 4, so it definitely showed that the pace was definitely there. But that being said, he was one of 3 front-running drivers, along with Hamilton and Tsunoda, who got knocked out in the first stage of qualifying. A bit of a shock that you have that many front runners out in Q1. But nonetheless, for Antonelli, the strategy worked very, very well for him. I think having the virtual safety car really early, starting on the softs, a track where overtaking was pretty difficult, I think all kind of benefited Antonelli. So I think even though, on paper going from 17th and then, getting on the podium in 3rd with the 2 disqualifications, with the 2 disqualifications kind of makes the result look a little bit better. The race pace, being able to hold those hard tires for so long was pretty impressive, but qualifying was a little bit weak. And, there were some circumstances there with the strategy and stuff that kind of, benefited him quite a bit as well. So I'm not going to put Antonelli, up in the top row. I think 8th place is a decent spot for him. Okay, number 7, I'm going to go with Isaac Hadjar. So for Hadjar, pretty solid Grand Prix overall. Qualified 8th, out-qualified by his teammate Lawson, but finished the Grand Prix in 6th place. So I think a pretty strong result in the Grand Prix. And again, not a whole lot to talk about. We didn't see him a whole lot, but outside of that, short period where he was basically holding up Piastri and Leclerc, got passed by both of them. But again, given that he's driving the Racing Bulls, I think that was, that's perfectly to be expected. Was the second best of the midfield drivers in terms of just race result. So I think a decent result overall, and he'll be happy with the big haul points that he picked up. Now, the driver having 6 is Nico Hülkenberg, and despite the fact Hülkenberg finished 7th, Hadjar 6th, The reason I'm putting Hulkenberg ahead of Hatcher is that Hulkenberg outqualified his teammate, Hatcher did not. So again, I'm holding that against Hatcher a little bit in this power ranking. But for Hulkenberg, qualified 11th, which is a decent result in the Sauber, and then the race finished 7th, so 6 big points haul, 6 big points for Hulkenberg. Another very opportunistic result, something that he's been doing quite a lot this season, which I think is, when we look back at it, I think it's going to make the point spread between himself and Bortolo look quite a bit bigger than I think the true performance differences between them in the races. But still, I think it's been a very solid season for Hulkenberg, and I think 6th place is a good spot for him. Okay, now moving on into the top 5. Number 5, I'm going to put your first, or your second, I guess, of your 2 McLarens in terms of the power rankings, and that is Lando Norris. So qualifying was very, very good. Got the car on pole despite the fact that he had a pretty poor third sector. I think really just shows how strong his first 2 sectors are, and again, credit has to go to Norris for that. But again, I do think that the McLaren was the fastest car by a pretty decent margin in qualifying. And so it was really, I think, his pole position to lose, given those circumstances. Then, in the Grand Prix, pretty clumsy first corner in terms of how he decided to go about defending his position from Verstappen. Of course, came very aggressively, and again, that was good. And again, you want to see that aggression from Norris, but then kind of forgot that he had to brake and, make the first corner, and so lost a position of Verstappen, loses a position in Russell. Poor first corner. And I know afterwards, again, at the end of the day, with the double disqualification, doesn't really matter how things went for Norris. But at the end of the day, I think if he had been able to keep that first corner, maybe he holds on to the race win. Cleaner is very, very important. But that being said, another driver's pace, of course, Verstappen's was very, very strong, and it was going to be pretty hard to deny him. But still, I think, it is possible that without that first corner, and again, of course, without the issues that, the plank issues that it seems like McLaren somehow realized that they were suffering with midway through the race, it's a possibility that, this race could have turned out very, very differently for Norris. Again, at the end of the day, probably would have led to the disqualification anyway, given that basically all 3 of the podium drivers will end up, getting scrutiny or checked after the race anyway. But at the end of the day, I thought it was a good weekend overall for Norris in terms of performance, but definitely not as good as what we saw in Mexico or in Brazil. Okay, moving into 4, and number 4, I'm going to go with Charles Leclerc. So for Leclerc qualifying, I hesitate to say disappointing, because we know that the Ferrari has struggled in wet conditions for a long, long time, and that's something that Leclerc basically admitted to after qualifying. We'll see how John Elkann takes that. Maybe he'll have to tell his drivers to stop talk less and focus on their driving more. But I thought that the race performance was very, very strong from Leclerc. Some very incisive overtakes on Piastri, Behrman, Hadjar. Very, very strong pace overall. It was kind of let down by his team strategy department, deciding that they were going to pit on exactly lap 25 and basically let themselves get, I think, undercut by Piastri, which was, I think, really, really clumsy. Didn't really change things at the end of the day, but perhaps if things had been a little bit different on the pit strategy, that maybe they would have ended up being able to be ahead of Antonelli instead of behind Antonelli. So that's something I think could have been a little bit better with Ferrari's strategy overall, but still not Leclerc's fault, and I thought he had a very, very strong weekend overall. Okay, so moving into the top 3. Number 3, I'm going to go with George Russell. For Russell, I thought it was a very strong weekend overall. Qualifies 4th. Maybe a little bit more performance there in qualifying. Hard to say. Ideally, you don't get out-qualified by Williams, but still, I think, considering the circumstances, I think it was a pretty strong qualifying overall for the Mercedes. And then in the Grand Prix, very strong opening lap, gets himself up to 2nd, but unfortunately was dealing with those what appeared to be power steering related issues, and so again, that's something that's not really his fault. But that being said, I do think Russell could have managed the tires a little bit better. We knew going into this race that managing the tires at the beginning of a tire stint was really going to be really important, just because of how fragile the tires are with the cold track conditions. And so Russell kind of, it seemed, took caution to the wind, as he sometimes does in these races, where it feels like he will decide that there's nothing to lose and he might as well just go gamble and go, all in. So he went really, really hard on trying to, get past Verstappen, and that didn't go so well. So he had to pit much earlier than he really had to. I think that then compromised him in the fight against Norris. At the end of the day, it didn't matter, but still I felt like Russell's decision-making with that could have been a little bit better. But ultimately, I think the power steering issues didn't really help either. But still, I think overall, really strong race from Russell. So number 1, number 2, I don't think this will be a big surprise. Number 2, I'm going with Carlos Sainz. Qualifying was about as perfect as you can get for Williams. Qualified third. Out-qualified cars, I think in general, should probably be quicker than his, even in wet conditions. So qualifying, very, very good. In the race, of course, finished 5th, would have finished 7th in the checkered flag. I think he had a 10 to 15 second gap on Hadjar, who is the next midfield runner. So lost positions to some of the cars that started behind him, like Russell, Piastri, Leclerc. But in the pit cycle, I think primarily. But given that the relative pace between the front-running cars and the Williams this weekend, I think that was to be expected. But that being said, I do think Sainz basically maximized his weekend, did an excellent job in Williams, and I think another really strong weekend, just like in Baku. And I think, it's a really tricky one. I think for Sainz, he's had really strong weekends this year, like this weekend, like Baku, but he's also had a number of really, really poor ones. And I think getting that race-to-race consistency, the execution being consistent, is something that Sainz, I think, is going to really have to focus on in 2026 if he wants to kind of cement himself as undisputed team leader. And should Williams not be a front-running team within the new regulations, and should, Sainz want to try to open the door to another front-running team, that's the kind of performance that he's going to have to put in if he wants to attract attention from the current front-running teams or whoever those teams are come 2026. Okay, number 1, I don't think there's a big surprise here, and that is, of course, Max Verstappen. Qualified second. I thought qualifying performance was, right about where you would expect him to be. I think pole position, if it had stayed full wet conditions, I think it was on the cards. But I think ultimately with the inters, I think second is still a very, very good spot, still out-qualified Piastri and the other McLaren. And given how dicey things were looking at the beginning of Q1, and, I think there were some question marks how far, would Verstappen even get out of Q1? If you go back and watch, the early stages of that session. But, the track, I think, eventually came to him. And, yeah, so for qualifying, Verstappen did an excellent job. Then the Grand Prix, I think, kind of schooled Norris at the start, did an excellent job with that. That could have been a disaster with, Norris coming across so aggressively. You notice on, Norris's onboard rear view camera, you can see that, Verstappen basically had to back off right away when Norris comes across. And so if he doesn't do that, that could have been, a pretty big crash, taking both of them out. And, the championship picture looks very, very different if that, is the case. But navigates that first corner and that first lap really, really well. And then the rest of the race just controlled the pace very, very strongly. And it looked like a almost 2023-esque performance. As Verstappen does what he has to do, set the fastest lap by a pretty big margin on the final lap of the race, and kind of really showing that he had a lot of extra pace in hand. So I think number 1 on the power rankings, no one's going to really disagree with that. And so there you go. That is my power rankings for the 2025 Las Vegas Grand Prix. So thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.